He set a trap for Bigfoot, but caught an alien girl instead. Jake Morrison had been tracking what the locals called Bigfoot for 3 months. As a wildlife biologist, he approached the sightings with scientific skepticism, but the evidence was compelling enough to warrant investigation. Deep in the Oregon wilderness, he'd set up his most sophisticated trap yet, a humane capture device equipped with motion sensors, designed to contain whatever was raiding campsites and leaving those massive footprints. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning mist clung to the forest floor as Jake checked his equipment one final time. The trap was a marvel of engineering, titanium-reinforced mesh walls that could contain a grizzly bear, but with padding to prevent injury. Solar panels powered the electronic locks and monitoring systems. If something big was out there, this would catch it safely. 3 months of raccoons and porcupines, Jake muttered, adjusting the bait. Fresh salmon and berries arranged to look natural. Either I catch this thing today or I admit defeat and go back to counting spotted owls. He retreated to his observation blind 50 yards away, settling in with his tablet to monitor the trap's sensors remotely. The forest was unusually quiet, as if every creature held its breath in anticipation. At 2:47 a.m., Jake's tablet screamed with alerts. Motion detected. Weight sensors triggered. Trap activated. His heart hammered as he grabbed his flashlight and approached cautiously. Nothing could have prepared him for what he found. Inside the cage was not the massive, hairy creature of legend. Instead, a small figure huddled in the corner, no taller than 5 feet, with skin that seemed to shimmer pale blue in the moonlight. She, somehow Jake instinctively knew it was female, wore what looked like a form-fitting suit made of an unknown material that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. Her most striking features were her eyes, large, luminous, and filled with absolute terror. They were the color of deep ocean water, with flecks that seemed to contain their own light. Her hair was silver white, falling in waves to her shoulders, and her face, while humanoid, had an ethereal quality that was unmistakably not human. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, and the figure recoiled at his voice, pressing herself harder against the far wall of the cage. She began speaking rapidly in a language that sounded like wind chimes mixed with dolphin clicks. Her voice was melodic, but urgent, pleading. Jake didn't need a translator to understand raw fear when he heard it. Hey, it's okay," Jake said softly, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien girl, for alien she clearly was, only cowered further, her breathing rapid and shallow. Tears streamed down her face, and Jake felt his heart break a little. This wasn't some monster or cryptid. This was a terrified young woman, far from home and trapped by his curiosity. Jake spent the next hour sitting cross-legged in front of the cage, speaking softly and trying to project calm. He'd turned off his flashlight after realizing the bright beam made her flinch, relying instead on the soft glow of her skin and eyes to see her in the darkness. "My name is Jake," he said repeatedly, pointing to himself. "Jake, human. I'm sorry about the trap. I wasn't trying to catch you." Gradually, her panicked breathing slowed. She studied him with those incredible eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. When he offered her water from his canteen, sliding it through the cage's feeding slot, she stared at it for long minutes before cautiously accepting it. The way she drank was telling. Desperate, as if she'd been dehydrated for days. Jake realized she might have been running through the forest for some time, possibly lost or hiding. The mysterious footprints and sightings suddenly made sense. Local witnesses had seen an alien refugee, not a cryptid. "Kira?" she said suddenly, pointing to herself with a delicate finger. Her voice was like silver bells. "Kira?" "Kira," Jake repeated, and something like relief flashed across her features. "That's your name? Kira?" She nodded, then launched into another stream of her musical language, gesturing frantically. Jake caught repeated sounds that might have been words, but the meaning was lost. Her growing agitation worried him. She kept pointing upward toward the sky, her expression shifting between fear and desperate hope. "Are you trying to tell me about your people? Your ship?" Jake asked gently. At the word ship, Kira's eyes widened. She nodded vigorously, then made a swooping gesture with her hands. But then her expression crumpled, and she spoke a single word that sounded heavy with loss. "Destroyed." Jake's blood ran cold. An alien refugee, possibly the sole survivor of some disaster. No wonder she was terrified. She was completely alone on a strange world, trapped by an unknown species. Jake knew he had to release her, but he was terrified she'd run back into the wilderness and disappear. Or worse, die from exposure or injury. The Oregon forests were unforgiving, and she clearly wasn't adapted for this environment. "I'm going to open the cage, Kira," he said slowly, pointing to the lock mechanism. "Open. Free. But please don't run. Let me help you." He input his code, and the cage door swung open with a soft hiss. Kira didn't bolt as he'd expected. Instead, she crept forward cautiously, like a wild animal testing the limits of a suddenly opened door. When she finally emerged, Jake got his first full look at her. She was breathtakingly beautiful in an otherworldly way, her proportions slightly off from human normal. Longer limbs, a more delicate bone structure, and that skin that seemed to hold starlight beneath its surface. Her suit was torn in several places, revealing what looked like minor injuries. She kept a careful distance between them, ready to flee at the first threatening move. Jake remained seated, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "Food?" he offered, pulling out energy bars and dried fruit from his pack. Kira's eyes fixed on the food with desperate hunger, but she shook her head frantically, backing away. She pointed to herself, then to Jake, then made a biting gesture at her own arm. Her expression was pure terror. It took Jake several confused moments to understand. You think I want to eat you?" Her reaction confirmed his guess. She nodded, tears flowing again, and gestured between them while making chomping motions with her delicate jaw. "Oh my God, no," Jake said, horrified. "No, Kira. Humans don't eat. We don't eat people. We don't eat other intelligent species, never." But how could he explain that to someone who didn't speak his language? Someone whose own experience with alien contact might be very different from human intentions? Jake realized that Kira's species might have encountered other aliens before, ones that were predators. The thought made him sick. How many worlds might contain species that viewed intelligence as just another form of prey? He needed to prove his intentions through actions, not words. Slowly, deliberately, Jake took one of his energy bars and ate it himself, making exaggerated chewing and swallowing motions. Then he offered another to Kira. She watched him with intense focus, as if cataloging every movement. When he didn't, suddenly turned savage after eating, some of the terror faded from her eyes. "Different food," Jake said, pointing to the bar, then to himself. "Human food, safe food." He repeated the process with different items: dried fruit, water, even sharing his coffee from a thermos. Each time he ate first, showing that these were normal foods, not some elaborate preparation for cannibalism. Slowly, Kira crept closer. When she finally accepted a piece of dried apple, her face lit up with wonder at the taste. She spoke in her musical language, and though Jake couldn't understand the words, her tone had shifted from terror to amazement. They spent hours in this careful dance of trust building. Jake showed her his equipment, explaining its purpose through gestures and simple demonstrations. When he showed her photos on his tablet, pictures of animals he'd studied, forests, other humans, she studied them with fascination. But when he accidentally opened his photo album to a family barbecue picture, Kira recoiled in horror. The image of humans gathered around grilled meat, laughing and eating, clearly triggered her fears again. "No, no," Jake said quickly, swiping to pictures of vegetables, fruits, bread. "We eat plants too, lots of plants. And, okay, yes, we eat animals, but not people. Never people. Never intelligent beings." The distinction seemed lost on her until Jake found pictures of his research work, him gently handling sedated bears for tagging, releasing rehabilitated eagles, feeding orphaned deer. Images of care, not consumption. As dawn approached, Jake realized they'd made remarkable progress. Kira no longer flinched at his every movement, and she'd even accepted his jacket when she started shivering in the pre-dawn cold. She wore it like a blanket, her head poking out endearingly from the oversized garment. But communication remained a challenge until Jake remembered his phone's language learning app. While it couldn't help with alien languages, it gave him an idea. He opened a drawing app and began sketching simple pictures. A stick figure labeled Jake, another labeled Kira. He drew them sharing food, drew himself helping injured animals, drew stars and tried to convey questions about her home. Kira watched with growing excitement. When he handed her the phone, she caught on immediately. Her first drawing was heartbreaking, a large shape that looked like a ship, surrounded by smaller attacking shapes, with debris falling toward a planet. Then she drew herself, alone, falling. "Your ship was attacked," Jake said softly. "You crashed here." She nodded, then drew more. Other beings that looked nothing like humans. Tall, angular creatures with too many teeth. She drew them clearly consuming smaller beings, including some that looked like her own species. Jake felt sick. Predators. You've encountered predator species before. Her next drawing showed the predators searching, and herself hiding. She'd been running and hiding since her crash, terrified that humans would be just another species of intelligent cannibals. But then she drew something that surprised Jake, herself watching humans from a distance. Clearly, she'd been observing them for some time before getting caught in his trap. She'd seen families, seen kindness, but fear had kept her from making contact. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. As the sun rose fully, Jake realized they'd reached a turning point. Kira had relaxed enough to sit beside him on the log he'd been using as a seat, though she still maintained careful distance. She was studying his face with curiosity rather than fear. "Your species," Jake said, pointing to her drawing of herself. "What are you called?" She spoke a word that sounded like flowing water over stones. When Jake tried to repeat it, she giggled, actually giggled at his pronunciation. The sound was like silver music. "And my species," Jake said, pointing to his drawing of humans. "We're called humans. Humans." "Humans," she repeated carefully, and Jake grinned at her accent. They were making progress, but Jake knew this was just the beginning. Kira was stranded on Earth, possibly the only one of her kind for light years in any direction. She needed protection, help, and eventually, maybe even a way home. But first, she needed to understand that not all species in the universe were predators, that some were protectors. Jake pulled out his phone and showed her news articles he'd downloaded. Humans rescuing whales, protecting endangered species, providing aid during disasters. Images of human compassion and cooperation. "This is what humans do," he said, pointing to pictures of doctors, teachers, rescue workers. "We protect, we help. We don't hurt the innocent." Kira studied the images intently, then looked up at Jake with those luminous eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and touched his hand. Her skin was surprisingly warm and seemed to tingle with some form of energy. She spoke in her language, but her tone was different now. Not fearful, but wondering. Then she pointed to herself, to Jake, and to the drawings of them together. She was asking a question. "Yes," Jake said softly, understanding somehow. "Friends, we can be friends." The morning sun was fully up now, and Jake knew he faced a decision that would change everything. He could contact the authorities, bring in scientists and government officials. Kira would become the most important discovery in human history. But she'd also become a specimen, studied and isolated, or he could protect her, at least until she was ready to face the wider world on her own terms. Looking at her, still fragile, still healing from whatever trauma had brought her to Earth, Jake knew what he had to do. My cabin, he said, pointing through the trees toward where his research station was located. Safe place, food, shelter, warmth. You can stay as long as you need. Kira tilted her head, not understanding all the words, but seeming to grasp the intent. She looked toward the forest where she'd been hiding, then back at Jake. No more running, Jake said gently. No more hiding alone. Let me help. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if reading something there. Then she nodded slowly and spoke a single word in her language that somehow conveyed gratitude deeper than any human thank you. As they walked together through the morning forest, Jake realized he'd come looking for a monster and found something far more precious, proof that the universe contained not just predators and prey, but also kindness, hope, and the possibility of friendship across the vast darkness between stars. Behind them, the abandoned trap sat empty in the clearing. No longer needed. The real capture had been something else entirely. The moment when two beings from different worlds chose trust over fear, protection over exploitation, and discovered that intelligence, compassion, and hope were truly universal languages. Epilogue. 3 months later, the autumn morning mist clung to the Oregon forest as Jake Morrison stepped onto the wraparound porch of his research station, coffee steaming in his hands. What had once been a simple utilitarian cabin designed for solitary wildlife research had undergone a remarkable transformation. Solar panels now dotted the roof in precise arrays, their surfaces gleaming with an efficiency that seemed almost too perfect for Earth technology. Additional monitoring equipment hummed quietly on extended platforms, and strange crystalline structures that served purposes Jake was only beginning to understand grew in carefully tended gardens around the property's perimeter. The changes weren't just technological. The very atmosphere of the place had shifted from the lonely outpost of a dedicated scientist to something that felt more like a home, a place where two very different species had learned not just to coexist, but to thrive together. Wind chimes that produced hauntingly beautiful melodies hung from the eaves, their tones designed to approximate the natural harmonics of Kira's homeworld. Jake had crafted them himself after months of listening to her unconscious humming, learning to recognize the frequencies that brought her comfort when homesickness threatened to overwhelm her. Jake, came a melodic voice from inside, accompanied by the soft chiming of her natural speech patterns that still sometimes slipped through when she was excited or focused. The northern owl family has successfully relocated to the expanded nesting site. Your conservation project is, how do you say, bearing fruit that feeds many generations? Jake smiled at her careful phrasing. Even after 3 months of intensive language exchange, Kira still constructed English sentences with the poetic sensibility of her native tongue. Her accent had softened, but remained distinctly otherworldly, vowels that seemed to carry harmonics no human throat could produce, and consonants that sometimes rang like struck crystal. It was beautiful. And Jake had learned to love the way she made even mundane scientific observations sound like verse. That's exactly right, he replied, stepping inside to find her at the expanded workstation they'd built together. And it's largely thanks to your insights about their extended family social structures. I never would have thought to provide communal nesting spaces. Kira looked up from the array of monitors displaying real-time footage from dozens of wildlife cameras throughout the forest. Her appearance had changed subtly over the months. The pallor and thinness of her first weeks, evidence of poor nutrition and constant stress, had given way to a healthy luminescence that seemed to emanate from within her translucent skin. Her silver hair had grown longer and now moved with a life of its own, sometimes responding to her emotions in ways that defied earthly physics. The torn and damaged biosuit she'd worn during their first encounter had been replaced by clothing adapted from human designs, but modified with her own biotechnology to better regulate her unique physiology. But it was her eyes that showed the most dramatic change. Where once they had held only terror and desperate wariness, they now sparkled with curiosity, warmth, and something Jake had come to recognize as contentment. She still carried sadness, the weight of being possibly the only one of her kind in this corner of the galaxy, but it no longer defined her every waking moment. Their daily routine had evolved naturally over the months. Kira proved to be an invaluable research partner, her alien perspective revolutionizing Jake's understanding of Earth's ecosystems. Where he saw individual species and isolated behaviors, she perceived intricate webs of relationship and communication that extended far beyond what human science had previously documented. She could sense electromagnetic fields generated by various animals, detect chemical signals that escaped human instruments, and somehow intuited social dynamics that took Jake years of observation to understand. The beaver family upstream is preparing for winter storage, she reported, pointing to thermal imaging that showed the animal's dam complex. But their communication patterns suggest anxiety. I believe the water temperature fluctuations we measured last week may be disrupting their instinctual timing. This was exactly the kind of insight that made their partnership so valuable. Kira didn't just observe wildlife. She seemed to empathically connect with it in ways that bridged the gap between scientific observation and intuitive understanding. Her abilities had helped them prevent 3 potential ecological disasters in the region, from identifying a disease outbreak among the local deer population before it could spread, to predicting a landslide that would have destroyed a crucial salmon spawning ground. In the evenings, their roles would reverse. While Jake updated research logs and corresponded with colleagues who believed he was working alone, Kira would take over the cabin's modified laboratory space. Here, she worked on projects that seemed to blend advanced alien science with Earth materials in ways that should have been impossible. She had somehow created a water purification system that not only cleaned their supply but actually enhanced it with minerals perfectly balanced for both human and alien physiology. She'd developed a power storage system that made their solar array 3 times more efficient than anything in commercial production. But her most ambitious project remained carefully hidden in the cabin's basement, in a space they'd excavated together during her 2nd month on Earth. Here, surrounded by crystalline structures that grew like living things but pulsed with electronic rhythms, Kira was building something that looked part telescope, part radio transmitter, and part living organism. She called it a star singer in her language, and Jake understood it to be a communication device capable of sending messages across interstellar distances. "How is your personal project coming along?" Jake asked gently, as he did every few days. He'd learned to approach the subject carefully, knowing it brought up complex emotions for her. Kira's expression grew thoughtful, and her hair seemed to dim slightly, a telltale sign of deeper emotions stirring. The star singer grows stronger. Each day, the crystalline matrices have finally achieved stable resonance with your planet's magnetic field. I believe I may be able to send a clear message within the next moon cycle. The weight of that statement settled between them. For 3 months, they'd existed in a bubble of relative normalcy, 2 beings from different worlds learning to be friends and colleagues. But the completion of her communication device would change everything. If there were others of her kind out there, survivors of the attack that had destroyed her ship and scattered her people, they would eventually receive her message. The question that haunted both of them was, what would happen then? "Are you ready for that?" Jake asked softly. For whatever response might come, Kira was quiet for a long moment, her luminous eyes fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with an impossible choice. "My people were explorers, Jake, seed carriers. We traveled between worlds not to conquer but to learn, to share knowledge, to find new forms of beauty in the cosmos. If any of us survive the attack, they are scattered alone, believing themselves the last of our kind. I cannot leave them in that darkness." She turned to face him fully, and Jake was struck once again by the otherworldly beauty of her features, the way her skin seemed to hold starlight beneath its surface, the impossible depth of her eyes, the delicate bone structure that spoke of evolution under different gravity and atmospheric conditions. But beyond the alien features, he saw something entirely familiar, the face of a friend grappling with a difficult decision. "But I also cannot leave you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You showed me that not all intelligent species are predators. You taught me that kindness exists even between creatures who share no common evolution. You gave me safety when I expected only death, friendship when I expected only exploitation, How do I choose between loyalty to my lost people and gratitude to the one who saved me? Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Over the months, he'd watched Kira transform from a terrified refugee into a confident, curious being who had found her place in his world. The thought of losing her, whether to the stars or to other humans who might not understand what she represented, had kept him awake many nights. But he'd also seen the way she stared at the night sky, heard the longing in her voice when she spoke of her homeworld's great libraries and singing forests. Maybe you don't have to choose, he said finally. Maybe the answer isn't either or, but both and. Kira tilted her head in the gesture he'd come to recognize as intense curiosity. Explain this concept, please. Jake moved to the large window that offered a view of the forest stretching endlessly toward the horizon. You've spent 3 months learning about Earth, about humans, about our ecosystems and our capacity for both destruction and protection. You've become an expert on our species in ways that no other being in the universe can claim. That knowledge, that perspective, it's valuable beyond measure. He turned back to her, seeing understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. When you contact your people, you won't just be telling them you survived. You'll be telling them about us, about humans, about Earth. You'll be the bridge between our species, the translator who can help both sides understand each other when the time comes for official contact. Kira's eyes widened, and her hair began to shimmer with excitement. You believe that time will come, that your people and mine will meet openly? I think it's inevitable, Jake said. You're proof that intelligence exists beyond Earth. Eventually, that truth will come out. When it does, wouldn't it be better if there was someone who understood both species? Someone who could help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that lead to fear and violence? The implications of what he was suggesting settled over them both. Kira wouldn't have to choose between her loyalty to her people and her connection to Earth. Instead, she could become something unprecedented, an interstellar ambassador, a being who belonged to both worlds and could help them understand each other. This would mean years of preparation, Kira said slowly, her scientific mind already working through the possibilities. I would need to learn more about human culture, politics, history. I would need to understand your species' capacity for both cooperation and conflict, and I would need to prepare my people for the reality of a species that is neither predator nor prey, but something more complex. Jake nodded. And I would need to prepare too. Learn more about your people, your culture, your needs. Eventually, I'll need to bring in others, carefully chosen humans who can help when the time comes for broader contact. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise fully over the forest they'd both come to love. In the distance, Jake could see the owl family Kira had mentioned, settling into their new communal nesting site. The sight filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction, not just because their conservation work was succeeding, but because it represented something larger. 2 different species, working together, creating something better than either could achieve alone. There is something else, Kira said quietly, and Jake heard a new note in her voice, something almost shy. In my culture, when 2 beings share knowledge and safety, when they work together to nurture life and growth, they become, the closest translation would be soul-paired. Not romantic love as humans understand it, but something deeper. A recognition that their paths are permanently intertwined, that they have become part of each other's story in ways that cannot be undone. Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest, understanding instinctively what she was trying to express. Over the past 3 months, their partnership had evolved into something he'd never experienced before. A connection that transcended species, culture, and even the vast distances between worlds. In human culture, he said softly, we might call that family, not by blood but by choice, by commitment to each other's well-being and growth. Kira smiled, an expression she'd learned from him but had made uniquely her own, somehow managing to convey joy in ways that made her entire being seem to glow from within. Yes, family by choice. I like this concept very much. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake's tablet chimed with an urgent alert from the forest monitoring system. They moved to the workstation together, falling automatically into the synchronized routine they'd developed for investigating unusual readings. What they found made them both catch their breath. The star singer in the basement was responding to something. Its crystalline structures pulsed with a rhythm Jake had never seen before, and the displays showed energy signatures that seemed to be growing stronger by the minute. "Kira," Jake said quietly. "I think someone out there is trying to answer." Her face went pale, then flushed with an excitement so intense that her hair began to move as if touched by an unfelt wind. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked truly alien. A being of starlight and impossible beauty preparing to reconnect with her own kind. But when she turned to him, her expression was calm, determined, and filled with a confidence that spoke of someone who had found her purpose. "Then it begins," she said simply. "Our real work begins now." Outside, the forest continued its ancient rhythms, unaware that it had just become the site of humanity's first successful interstellar communication. But Jake and Kira knew that everything was about to change. They had become more than friends, more than research partners. They had become the bridge between worlds, the proof that intelligence and compassion could overcome any distance, any difference, any fear. And as the star singer's pulse grew stronger, reaching out across the vast darkness between stars with a message of survival, hope, and newfound friendship, both human and alien understood that their greatest adventure was just beginning. Author's note: this story explores themes of first contact, trust, and the assumption that intelligence inherently leads to cooperation rather than predation. The HFY, humanity, HFY genre, celebrates positive human traits like compassion, protection of the innocent, and our tendency to befriend rather than exploit other species, qualities that might be rare in a universe where intelligence could have evolved along very different paths.